Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Halloween week 2019, Freehold Township, New Jersey. 25-year-old Stephanie Pars leaves a family evening and drives the short route back to her home. By morning, there is only silence. No check-in, no posts, no routine, made-at-home text. There is no 911 call. There is no obvious scene. In cases like this, time isn't just a factor. Time is evidence. The first hours matter. Family attempts to reach Stephanie fail. She does not show up as expected. A welfare check follows. Patrol officers note the basics. Residents secured, no public report of forced entry or a violent interior. The priority becomes establishing a clock the case can trust. When she left her mother's, the expected drive time, the last confirmed communication window, and who, if anyone, was in contact afterward. These aren't dramatic moments for television. They're the bones of a lawful investigation. And Freehold Township sits in Monmouth County, minutes from highways that connect neighborhoods to commercial corridors lined with brush and intermittent woodlots. Investigators know that absence of a visible scene doesn't mean absence of a crime. It means the story must be built out of small, verifiable decisions. Collect what can be collected, document what can be documented, and lock down whoever last saw or messaged the victim. In towns like this, the difference between a misunderstanding and a major case is usually one provable timestamp. Stephanie's name is logged. Her routine is sketched from interviews with family and friends, work, social life, the pattern of visiting her mother, the short drive back. Officers preserve access to her personal effects that are within lawful reach, and detectives move to protect the digital footprint, calls, texts, app pings that can legally be captured and reviewed. They don't speculate, they sequence. When did she leave? What route would she most likely take? What did she send or read en route? What was the last verifiable message associated with her device? If a neighbor camera exists and is voluntarily available, it's noted. If it doesn't, there's no invented narrative. The language stays exact because the record will be tested later. By the end of day one, the absence of a clear scene has a procedural consequence. The map becomes the case. Without blood, forced entry, or a public forensic hit inside the residence, investigators need to widen out intelligently rather than wildly. That means a terrain-first approach led by search coordinators who understand where a missing person search differs from a crime scene search. Lines of brush along Route 9, drainage cuts, easements, places a person might pass unnoticed at night, places ground teams can cover efficiently, then cover again if new information suggests it. The family is briefed in sober terms. The case is treated as a missing adult with suspicious circumstances, not because a single piece of evidence screams foul play, but because the pattern of silence is atypical for Stephanie and the timeline offers no benign explanation. Detectives keep interviews tight and specific: recent disputes, changes in routine, anyone who disagreed with her, anyone who might have expected to see her after the family visit. Names and numbers go into a log that will later matter when the digital review starts to match message times with human recollection. There's pressure to move fast, but the work stays methodical. A detective will say later that the data from that first day aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. Clean timelines with no noise can mask what's missing. Was there a call that never connected? A message written but unsent? A moment when a phone's behavior changed for reasons that only become clear weeks later? Those questions are parked for the digital team that will come online as soon as lawful extraction is arranged. Search planning stands up even as interviews continue. Volunteers want to help. The county will need them. But before hundreds of people walk the same strips of land, someone has to draw the grid and set the rules. You don't pick areas based on rumor. You pick them based on access, sightlines, water, and how far a person could realistically travel in a given window. The first pass eliminates obvious gaps. The second pass, if needed, tells you what you missed the first time. Researching the same ground isn't an admission of failure. It's the discipline that keeps a case from drifting on guesswork. Back at the residence, there is restraint. No public report of a violent interior scene means no dramatization. This isn't a story about blood smears or staged cleanups because the record does not show those things. This is a story about a young woman who left a familiar place at a reasonable hour and vanish between one safe space and another. That distance, the ordinary suburban stretch between a mother's home and a daughter's home, becomes the investigation's first field of view. As hours turn into the first full day, the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office assumes a central role. Case control is formalized, a single case number, evidence custody protocols, and a directive to protect the integrity of whatever digital records can be recovered. Investigators review recent calls and texts around the evening of October 30th. A late-night social app ping while she was en route becomes part of the sequence. It will be important not because it proves a crime, but because it may corroborate that she was still active, still in transit, and still on her own schedule, until she wasn't. Interview notes begin to converge on a picture of Stephanie that is consistent across sources. She is close to family. She shows up when she's supposed to show up. She doesn't simply go off-grid. These are not assumptions. They are statements investigators cross-check so they can justify resources at scale. The threshold for a major search is not panic. It's a pattern that cannot be explained by the ordinary. That threshold is met. Neighbors are contacted politely but directly. Did anyone see her vehicle late? Did a doorbell camera capture an approach? Was there noise? A car idling longer than usual? None of this is dramatic in the telling. It is granular, scheduled, and written down. If a camera exists, investigators will request it properly. If it doesn't, it's not retrofitted into the narrative. And the discipline here will be the same discipline they'll need months later when they report to the public what they can and cannot say. By now, the investigation has two synchronized tracks. Track 1, people, family, friends, anyone with a claim on her time or attention, anyone who says they expected to see her that night or the next morning. Track 2, data, the phone's record, the message logs, the app traces that modern life leaves behind. The goal of Day 1 and Day 2 isn't to produce a suspect. It's to produce a timeline that will survive challenge, a geography tied to real places, and an evidence list that can be audited. A second reality sets in. With no public report of a crime scene inside the home, your scene is now everywhere her timeline touches. That includes the modest route between 2 points, the edges along highway corridors, and any place where a phone might later be shown to switch states, from active to inactive, from moving to still. It also includes people, anyone whose contemporaneous messages reflect agitation, pressure, or unwanted contact. Those at this stage remain risk indicators, not conclusions. The language stays precise for a reason. The day ends with a plan. Volunteers will be brought in under supervision. Specialized teams will walk areas already flagged by terrain analysis. Detectives will keep the interview log clean and the digital requests moving. The county's message to the family is measured. We are searching, we are listening, we are building. There is no promise of what comes next, only the promise that every process that finds people, the ones who are lost, the ones who are harmed, the ones who are still waiting, will be put to work for Stephanie. There is also something more difficult to say out loud. When there is no obvious scene, the investigation often moves in two contradictory feelings at once: urgency and restraint. Urgency to cover ground before evidence degrades. Restraint to avoid contaminating whatever might still be found. That balance is the job. And on the first day of this case, the balance holds. Within 24 hours of Stephanie Parzy's disappearance, the missing person protocol had already shifted toward a structured search operation. Freehold Township was not new to coordinated ground searches, but the scale here demanded precision. Without an obvious indoor scene to process, investigators and search coordinators understood they would have to treat the entire corridor between her mother's home and her own as potential ground zero. The first operational meeting broke the geography into zones. Law enforcement, supported by trained volunteers, mapped out an arc that extended from the immediate residential streets to the mixed-use edges along Route 9. The selection was deliberate. Each sector was chosen for access, concealment potential, and proximity to plausible travel routes. This wasn't guesswork. Search managers relied on aerial maps, terrain familiarity, and historical knowledge of where past recoveries, both safe and otherwise, had been made in Monmouth and neighboring Middlesex County. From a procedural standpoint, the plan had to be tight. Every assigned search grid included coordinates, designated entry and exit points, and a reporting schedule. Teams logged their sweeps in real time, ensuring that coverage could be verified and, if necessary, repeated. The absence of a scene at Stephanie's home meant that any trace, footwear impressions, personal effects, disturbed vegetation, would carry more weight because it would be one of the few physical links investigators could work with. By mid-morning on the second day, canine units were deployed. Their handlers were briefed on the last confirmed clothing description, but the priority was to pick up any fresh human scent moving away from key points on the map. Dogs worked both residential and roadside brush, with searches documented in the same format as human sweeps. In this kind of case, redundancy wasn't waste. It was insurance against error. The search didn't just follow land. Investigators knew that drainage culverts, retention ponds, and narrow water channels near commercial strips could not be ignored. Specialized teams inspected these features using poles, underwater cameras where safe, and by coordinating with public works to manage access. Each location was cleared or flagged for follow-up, with the results logged into the master incident report. One of the most significant procedural steps at this stage was the integration of interview data into the physical search plan. Notes from those who saw or communicated with Stephanie in her last known hours informed which sectors were treated as higher priority. For example, if a credible witness placed her vehicle on a certain arterial within a specific window, the surrounding grid was expanded, not contracted. The goal was to work from knowns outward, not from theories inward. The community response was immediate and organized. Volunteer turnout was strong, but law enforcement kept strict control over assignments. Each civilian was paired with a trained lead, briefed on what to look for, and instructed to report findings without handling them. Any item of potential evidentiary value, no matter how mundane, was to be marked and left in place until properly collected. This ensured chain of custody integrity, a detail that becomes critical in court even if the discovery itself is months away from its legal relevance. The search plan also accounted for the reality that some areas might need to be covered more than once. Weather, light conditions, and the angle of approach can change what's visible. Researching isn't about doubt. It's about increasing the odds that a small but significant detail isn't missed simply because it was viewed from the wrong perspective the first time. Investigators kept the family updated in measured terms. They understood that each new sector covered could bring hope or dread, but the messaging stayed consistent. The process is methodical. The areas are chosen for specific reasons, and nothing is left to casual chance. Public communication mirrored this, urging anyone with information, however minor it seemed, to step forward. In missing person cases with suspicious circumstances, it's often the fragment that completes the picture. The logic guiding these operations is what separates disciplined searches from ad hoc efforts. Every foot of ground cleared under protocol becomes part of the official record, ready to be correlated later with other investigative streams. This is how the search phase connects directly to forensic analysis and interview data, building a foundation strong enough to carry the weight of whatever evidence might eventually surface. In towns like Freehold, large-scale searches are rare. When they do happen, they alter the rhythm of the place. Roadside businesses watch uniformed teams work the brush. Residents mark which streets get cordoned off. Traffic slows for checkpoints. It's a reminder that in a community of this size, a case like Stephanie's isn't just a personal tragedy. It's a shared disruption that demands collective focus. By the third day, the ground search was still active, but investigators began turning more attention to the who as much as the where. Building the relational map around Stephanie Pars meant reviewing not just the hours before she vanished, but the months leading up to it. This phase isn't built on speculation, it's built on documented patterns, reports, calls, and witness statements that can be verified. Stephanie's family and close friends were interviewed in more depth. This wasn't about casual conversation. Detectives pressed for dates, times, and examples of any incidents that hinted at conflict, fear, or control in her personal life. Those conversations revealed prior tensions with an ex-boyfriend. It wasn't hearsay. Public court records confirmed a domestic violence complaint in September 2019, weeks before she went missing. The complaint cited an altercation in which police were called, and while it did not result in a felony charge, it was enough to mark a behavioral pattern that investigators could not ignore. From a procedural standpoint, this type of information serves multiple purposes. First, it identifies individuals who may have had motive or opportunity. Second, it informs risk assessment. whether the missing person is statistically more likely to be harmed by a stranger or by someone they know. National data and law enforcement experience show that in adult missing person cases with suspicious circumstances, prior domestic violence in the victim's circle is a significant red flag. Detectives also obtained phone and text records for the period preceding October 30th. They looked for spikes in contact, unusual late-night calls, or messages showing escalating disputes. Digital forensic review at this stage was preliminary. Court orders for full content extraction take time. Still, even basic call logs could reveal patterns, such as repeated unanswered calls from the same number or abrupt halts in communication after a certain date. Each entry was logged for correlation with interviews. Friends described Stephanie as someone who did not ghost people without reason. When she stopped responding to a particular person's messages, they noticed. Investigators matched these observations against actual message metadata, looking for consistency. The data alignment here was more than a coincidence. It mirrored the change in her availability that family had reported. Detectives also reviewed law enforcement contact history for anyone connected to Stephanie. This is standard, not because every contact implies guilt, but because it builds a timeline of interactions with law enforcement, whether as a suspect, complainant, or witness. In this case, the review revealed multiple prior police contacts involving the same individual tied to the September domestic violence complaint. At no point in this phase did investigators publicly name a suspect. This was deliberate. Naming too early can damage both the case and the ability to gather unfiltered statements from people in the person's circle. Instead, they kept the scope broad while privately flagging higher-risk individuals for more urgent background work. From a human standpoint, these days were the hardest for Stephanie's family. The search was still underway, but they were beginning to understand that investigators were also building a risk profile that might explain her disappearance in darker terms. In towns like Freehold, where social networks overlap and people often know each other's histories, the realization that danger may have been close to home can fracture trust in ways that last for years. By the end of the first week, interviews and the engineered search had done what they could. To move the case, investigators needed the phones. That meant lawful preservation requests to carriers, search warrants for content, and full forensic extractions on devices already in police custody or voluntarily surrendered. The goal was simple. Build a defensible digital ladder that starts with the last normal moment and ends at the first unexplained silence. The team began with what they could obtain fastest: subscriber information, call detail records, and messaging logs tied to Stephanie Parz's number around the night she left her mother's home in Freehold Township. Those returns don't answer why, but they answer when and who was trying to reach whom. In parallel, a separate set of warrants covered cloud content for major messaging apps. The point wasn't to trawl her private life. The point was to lock the timeline with objective data that could verify or contradict human memories. Extraction on any seized device followed standard chain of custody. Each phone, once lawfully acquired, was photographed, labeled, and logged. A digital specialist created a forensic image and worked from the image, not the live phone, to protect evidentiary integrity. Where encryption blocked immediate access, the lab queued decryption attempts and documented each step, every error code, every permission granted, every delay. Nothing moves to analysis until the paperwork is clean. What the lab could read first were the metadata patterns. The last confirmed outgoing activity from Stephanie's device, including a social app ping while she was en route, set the top rung of the ladder. After that, the contact map tightened. Investigators saw who attempted to reach her, which calls were unanswered, and where strings of messages bunched in the hours before she went off the grid. One cluster stood out, not because of a single shocking line of text, but because of frequency, timing, and tone documented in records later cited in court filings. A series of angry, unanswered messages from an ex-boyfriend in the narrow window before she vanished. With that cluster identified, detectives widened the scope. They obtained legal authority to image the ex-boyfriend's phone and associated devices, along with other relevant devices in Stephanie's circle. Investigators do not assume one person is responsible because messaging looks aggressive. They test whether the sequence of communications lines up with the rest of the case. Did the same number attempt contact after she disappeared? Did the outreach change tone? Or did it stop entirely? An abrupt silence that can be as informative as any message. The technical team kept their analysis disciplined. They reconciled timestamps across platforms to avoid time zone or daylight-saving issues that can quietly mislead. They matched call attempts to cell network logs for durability. For app data, they recorded message IDs and server confirmation artifacts when available. If content remained inaccessible behind encryption at this stage, the team did not fill the gap with guesses. They left a placeholder that could be resolved when the warrant returns completed or decryption succeeded. As the device picture sharpened, the interview picture came back into view. Friends who described escalating tension now had correlates in the message frequency records. Family members who said Stephanie stayed reliable had support from routine check-ins visible on her timeline, until the night that routine stopped. This is where digital evidence earns its place. It doesn't create motive, but it validates the pattern that investigators are allowed to treat as risk. A separate question mattered just as much. What did the ex-boyfriend do after Stephanie went silent? Investigators reviewed his device usage around the same window. A rush of calls from a person who's genuinely worried looks different than a sequence of hostile messages that ends when a victim stops replying. Those are not moral judgments. They're behavioral markers that analysts are trained to read. Where the record was incomplete, the report said so plainly. At this stage, authorities were prepared to publicly identify a person of interest by name, John Osbilgen. The decision wasn't driven by a single text or a single interview. It came from the combined weight of documented risk, prior domestic violence history on record, plus the communication pattern the night before the disappearance and the absence of contradictory evidence pointing to someone else. Naming him served two immediate purposes. It set an accurate frame for public tips, and it signaled that the investigation was now tracking one primary line while keeping others open. None of this turned the case into a trial by headline. Investigators still had to finish the extractions, process returns from carriers, and translate raw logs into a narrative a jury could understand if the case ever reached that point. An analyst wrote what every good analyst writes in a high-profile missing person case. Correlation is not cause, but in combination with the history we verified, the correlation is probative. That sentence belongs in a file, not on television. Yet it explains why responsible agencies do not announce conclusions before the evidence can carry them. The human side of these days was quiet but real. Family members wanted immediate answers. The case could only move at the speed of lawful process. Volunteers still walked assigned grids because absence of a body does not equal absence of a crime. Detectives balanced both truths: keep searching the ground, keep reading the devices. The right answer could come from a boot and brush or a line in a log. And in towns like this, technology and community often meet at the same intersection. A neighbor shares camera footage that offers a timestamp the carrier logs can lean on. A friend remembers a detail that now matters because a message thread confirmed the date. This is how modern cases move. The technology is precise, but it still needs people to tell it where to look. As the week closed, the lab briefed command on a preliminary timeline built from verifiable digital artifacts. It had clear thresholds: last normal activity, escalation window, silence. It included lawful acquisition steps so defense could audit them later. It did not speculate about locations that the record could not support. No GPS claims were made where none existed in the file. The report closed with a limited conclusion. A specific ex-boyfriend, now publicly identified as John Osbilgen, showed documented hostility and a messaging pattern that aligned with the final hours before Stephanie disappeared. That alignment made him the focus of the next phase. Before all the decryption results landed, the case tempo changed. The person of interest's custody status would become the story. Once the digital analysis from the lab had given investigators a person of interest, the next step wasn't a murder arrest. The case still had no confirmed cause of death, no recovered remains, and no physical scene tying a suspect to a fatal act. But there was a separate, actionable offense on the table, one with enough probable cause to justify detention while the missing person investigation continued. Detectives built the supporting affidavit quickly, detailing not only the risk factors but also the unrelated criminal evidence uncovered in the course of their search. That evidence, tied to prohibited material on the suspect's device, met statutory thresholds in New Jersey for immediate arrest. This wasn't the primary case they wanted to file, but it gave them a narrow window to keep John Osbilgen in custody, apply pressure through interviews, and protect the community While the search for Stephanie Pars continued, Osbilgen was taken into custody under that separate charge. Standard booking procedures followed: fingerprints, photographs, property inventory, and intake medical screening. Detectives used the first hours of lawful detention to reapproach certain inconsistencies in his earlier statements, this time with the context of the digital records. When asked directly if he had any knowledge of Stephanie's whereabouts, his answers stayed within the rights afforded by counsel. He neither admitted nor provided new leads. While he was in custody, the prosecution prepared a detention motion citing community safety concerns, prior documented violence in dating relationships, and his digital communication pattern on the night of October 30th. The motion acknowledged that this was not yet a homicide case, but argued that the overlap between the two investigations made him a significant threat if released. In court, the defense countered with the argument that the current charge was unrelated to Stephanie's disappearance, and that the state had not produced direct evidence linking him to her current status. Judges in New Jersey are bound by statutory detention criteria. Without a qualifying violent charge directly tied to the disappearance, the bench sided with the defense on release. Osbilgen walked out of the Monmouth County facility under standard release conditions. Surveillance from the department confirmed his movements home. He remained on the investigative radar, but the control officers had over his mobility and communication was now gone. For the investigative team, this was a pivot point. It meant that any next step, be it further search warrants, additional forensic testing, or surveillance, had to be more precise. It also meant the family would see the man publicly identified as a person of interest moving freely in the community, which carried its own emotional and public safety weight. There's a constant balance in cases like this: the burden of proof versus the urgency to protect. Investigators knew the custody period had not been wasted. More forensic returns had arrived while he was inside. But the absence of physical evidence connecting him to a homicide meant that the clock was now in his favor. This release did not change the standing priorities: recover Stephanie, preserve evidence, and maintain the integrity of the case file so it could withstand defense challenges later. The next strategic move would focus on tracing the last known paths, both his and hers, before October 31st. By this point in the investigation, the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office had compiled a large volume of search logs, interview transcripts, and cell phone extraction reports. The missing person case had been active for over 2 months, and each day without resolution meant more pressure on detectives to justify the scale of the operation. The forensic focus shifted to comparative analysis, taking what they had already collected and re-examining it against fresh digital records. John Osbilgen's devices had been seized earlier in the investigation. While prior analysis had identified disturbing internet history and messaging patterns, investigators now ran that data through timeline reconstruction software. They wanted to determine if the digital activity could be overlaid directly with known search and sighting events related to Stephanie. Detectives also revisited witness statements from the days immediately before her disappearance. Friends had described normal interactions with Stephanie, nothing to indicate an imminent danger. But one friend's statement contained a small, previously overlooked detail, a vague mention of her plans to settle some things with someone she had dated before. That reference didn't change the suspect list. John had been the only ex-boyfriend under scrutiny, but it added weight to their decision to cross-check the device data against those final movements. Parallel to this, law enforcement's geographic mapping unit consolidated all prior search grids, noting which sectors had been covered more than once. Using drone surveillance logs and volunteer search crew reports, they began to highlight anomalies, small pockets of terrain that had been visually cleared but lacked any formal ground evidence report. In a case like this, the absence of evidence on paper could be just as telling as its presence. While this analysis progressed, the investigative team quietly maintained surveillance on John. Even after his release from custody on unrelated charges, his behavior remained of interest. Reports noted him traveling between his residence in Freehold Township and neighboring towns. Investigators documented these trips, but kept the surveillance discreet, avoiding any move that could be construed as harassment or preemptive accusation. The goal was to monitor patterns, not provoke them. What made this phase critical was the slow alignment of separate investigative threads: device forensics, mapped search anomalies, and behavioral monitoring. Each on its own was circumstantial. Together, they hinted at a narrowing set of possibilities about where the truth and Stephanie might be found. By early January, the operation moved into a phase that investigators often refer to as pressure consolidation. The major search grids were already documented, the digital evidence archive was extensive, and now the team began building operational scenarios from that combined intelligence. From the device forensics completed earlier, they had precise message timestamps, search queries, and social media activity logs. A forensic data analyst overlaid those against patrol logs and community tip-line reports, looking for correlation points that might have been overlooked when the information came in separately. One notable pattern emerged. Several of John Osbilgen's late-night movements coincided with small gaps in his phone's messaging activity, windows where he appeared to be offline entirely. Those gaps were short, sometimes under an hour, but they repeated across specific days. Detectives marked them for follow-up because they overlapped with timeframes when Stephanie's whereabouts remained unaccounted for. This prompted a targeted request for surveillance footage from municipal and commercial sources along those travel routes. Although several weeks had passed, a few businesses retained archives long enough to provide partial coverage. While no single frame offered conclusive proof, the footage confirmed vehicle travel consistent with the suspect's known car make and model in the direction of unsearched terrain. The legal standard for probable cause hadn't been met, but the tactical value for search planning was clear. Parallel to the digital work, search coordinators reassembled their ground units. This time, instead of broad sweeps, they used precision targeting. Small, specialized teams with K-9 units trained for human remains detection. They concentrated on the pockets of land flagged in the geographic mapping review, areas previously seen from the air but never processed on foot. The weather was cold, the ground partially frozen, and each search required logistical planning to avoid compromising potential evidence. These two streams, refined digital mapping and selective ground operations, were now moving in parallel, each informing the other. When a location came into focus digitally, it went onto the physical search list. When a ground search revealed anomalies, it fed back into the geographic profile. The goal wasn't to rush a find, but to close every possible gap in the investigative net. Under cold January skies, 77 days after Stephanie Parrs vanished, investigators finally located her remains along a wooded stretch near Route 9 in Old Bridge, New Jersey. The discovery came after weeks of coordinated searches using drones, cadaver dogs, and ground teams, an operation that had methodically narrowed search zones based on phone records, vehicle movement analysis, and interviews. The terrain was consistent with earlier search grids, suggesting the site was not selected at random but chosen for concealment. The medical examiner's report concluded the cause of death was undetermined, a finding not uncommon in cases where decomposition has progressed and no obvious trauma is present. Even without a definitive cause, the physical evidence and timeline alignment reinforced the working theory investigators had built from day one. By this stage, the focus had shifted almost entirely to John Osbilgen, Stephanie's former boyfriend. His digital footprint showed repeated contacts with her on the night of October 30th, 2019. In the weeks following her disappearance, he faced unrelated criminal charges, and during that time, investigators uncovered disturbing communications and a documented history of domestic incidents. Before formal homicide charges could be filed, Osbilgen was found dead in his home from an apparent suicide. Next to him was a handwritten note in which he admitted involvement in Stephanie's death, eliminating remaining doubts about the link between suspect and victim. For the Parrs family, the recovery of Stephanie's remains allowed for a burial and a measure of closure, though the absence of a trial meant no public cross-examination of facts. For detectives, the resolution underscored the importance of persistent search work and evidence correlation, even when forensic results leave gaps. In law enforcement circles, this case has been cited as an example of how thorough procedural discipline can bring a case to conclusion, despite a lack of cause-of-death confirmation. Cases like this remind us that behind every headline is a network of people, family, friends, investigators, whose persistence matters. In the end, the pursuit of truth served both justice and community awareness, reaffirming that in the field of true crime, closure often comes from the sum of all evidence, not a single definitive finding. Looking back on this case, I'm reminded that safety is not something we can take for granted. It's something we must actively protect. Stephanie's story is a painful reminder that warning signs matter, and that speaking up, reaching out, and staying connected to our loved ones can make all the difference. As someone who's walked you through every detail, my hope is that you carry forward not just the facts, but the lessons. Trust your instincts, check in on people you care about, and know that help is always worth seeking. If this video resonated with you or touched your heart, let me know in the comments. Share where you're watching from or your own thoughts on how communities can stay safer. And if it didn't, tell me why. Your feedback matters. If you want more true crime stories told with care and precision, please subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Stay safe, stay aware, and take care of each other.